worked out. One was swap shop, where someone was always trying to trade a bike for a pony or something. I don't know. But we did swap shop. Do y'all have something like swap shop here? See, that's what it is, swap shop. But then usually besides swap shop, now I'm going to probably be carbon dating myself here, but Barney, dinosaur, carbon dating. I also grew up after swap shop was over with Paul Harvey. How many here, at least as old as me, would know what I'm talking about? Paul Harvey, page 2. Remember? And the rest of the story. And I would thrill to the story because he'd kind of put out the little teaser. You know what I'm talking about? He put out the teaser about here's kind of the story you thought you knew, but then he brings it home with the rest of the story. So, that's what I've been thinking on, because for the past few weeks we've been looking here at different parables that Jesus taught. And you know what? When you think about that, it's amazing. Jesus taught in parables, which means it seems like simple stories, but the simple stories that he taught 2,000 years ago, we remember. And we talk about them now. That's a pretty amazing teacher when you think about it. Luke 15 is one of those kind of stories that Jesus used. And there's something about, it's the story of the prodigal son, but in the Bible, you know what? Here's Barney's theory. I think that a lot of us grew up with flannel graph kind of things and Bible school stories, and so we got a little bit of the story, but we didn't always get the whole story. Just had a conversation with a friend this week. We got together to study. No, I'm sorry, it was 2 weeks ago. And we were talking about Jonah. Who knows the story of Jonah and the whale? Right? And Jonah and the whale, God tells Jonah, you go to Nineveh and you go and you preach there. And Jonah says, I'm going the other way, right? So he goes the other way, and I always heard, well, he was afraid of the people in Nineveh and he didn't go. And then finally, they throw him overboard. He gets swallowed by the fish, right? Praise to God for deliverance. He gets puked up onto the side of the... puked isn't pastoral, but you know what I'm saying. Regurgitated, whatever. But he winds up out of the fish and on the beach, okay? And so he goes and he preaches to Nineveh, and the people all turn, and God forgives them, and it's all good. End of story. Except that's not the end of the story at all. Anyone know that? You know what the end of the story is? Jonah goes up on the hillside, sits down, waits to see all these people, to see them get blown up. And then you find out he wasn't scared of Nineveh at all. He hated Nineveh. And he put it together that if he didn't go, they wouldn't hear. And if they didn't hear, they wouldn't turn. And if they didn't turn, God wouldn't forgive them. Instead, he'd blow them up. So the whole story ends with Jonah mad at God. And he tells God, in no uncertain terms, didn't I tell you it'd be just about like you to go and forgive them? I never heard that in Sunday school. I never heard that at Vacation Bible School. I just heard the good story. I didn't hear about the prophet that had a heart problem. That's the rest of the story. You want me to go on? Because there's other juicy stuff that we never heard. It didn't make it quite into the Sunday school lesson that way, or it didn't serve the preacher's purposes quite that way, but they're in there. I'll go one more and then we'll get to the real thing, okay? We all know the story of Noah and the ark, right? And you go bring the animals on how many? 2 by 2, right? Got the great flood, that whole thing. Then they come off the ark after everything's done. Of course, he sent the bird, and then the bird comes back. They come out. It says that Noah built an altar, offered a sacrifice, and then you read down a little bit. It says God puts his bow, the rainbow, in the sky. Remember? And what's the rainbow in the sky? It's a symbol of his promise. He's not going to destroy the world like this again, right? End of story. Not quite. You know what the rest of Noah's story is? Anybody? He goes into farming. Did you know that? And he got into the farm. Not only did he get into farming, he must have really got into the farming because he got into the wine. He got too much wine, got drunk, fell asleep naked in his tent. His sons come in, find him, they cover him up. He figures out what happens. He gets mad and he curses them. End of story. Doesn't fit on a flannel graph, I guess. That's the rest of the story. Check it out. Genesis chapter 9. The The point is that sometimes we know stories or we know parts of stories, but we don't necessarily know the whole story. And sometimes what the Scriptures bring us in the whole story is you see life more truly. You don't just see the one slice, you see the truth of life. Now, 2 weeks ago we started on the story of the prodigal son. Who knows that story? Who thinks you know the story? It's a story with three strands. Usually we hear the story about the prodigal. He goes away, right? Life gets bad. He comes to himself, comes home. Dad says, kill the fatted calf. We're going to have the party, and everything's good. End of story. No, it's not. There are three strands in the story of the prodigal son. Did you know that? There's the story of the prodigal. His whole deal is, Dad, I wish you were dead. Right? When he asks for his inheritance comes when Dad's put in the ground. So I want my inheritance, which means, Dad, I wish you were dead. And since you're not dead, at least get out of my way. I'm not interested in you. All I want is your stuff. And now I'm going to go and do my thing without you complicating my life. Anyone ever play that little song? I did. Anyone else? 2 people. All right. You lie. There's another part to the story. And the other part of the story is the brother who stays home. We looked at that last week. And the brother who stays home, we see that story play out at the end of the story when the prodigal comes home. And when the prodigal comes home, the older brother doesn't want any part of it. And then we find out why. He said, I've been slaving for you. You never did anything for me. But this son of yours shows up after he's blown everything. And here we are. And so the whole story ends with the father outside of the feast trying to get the older brother to come into the feast. Isn't that interesting? Now let me put this out. This is free. There's 2 ways, 2 really, really good ways you see in this story to get disconnected and separated from God. Here's the first one. Just go the way of self-expression. I'm about me. I'm going to do my thing. I don't want some father. I don't want some God to be kind of hindering me. I'm going to do what I want, and God can be dead as far as I care. That's one way to wind up really, really far away from God. Agreed? Good. Here's the other. The other way to wind up really far from God isn't through rebellion. The other way to wind up really far from God is through religion. It's true. The other way to, at least according to this story, the way to wind up very far away from the Father is by thinking you are earning your way. And that by you being good enough and you earning your way, then the Father's going to owe you. And we see by the end of the story that the older brother is as far away from the Father as the younger brother was. Follow me? That's part of the rest of the story. But there's 3 strands, right? The prodigal, the older brother, and then there's the father. You all know the story, right? What I'm going to do is, if you have your scriptures, I'm going to simply refer to a couple of verses as we go, and you can check me out on it. The strand of the story that is the father starts with this. The father, in the story Jesus tells, Jesus is trying to tell people who have been far from God, who are there in the audience, and he's trying to talk to people who have been quote-unquote near as far as the more religious folks, and he's trying to tell them what the heart of God really is. So the whole thing starts, the son comes and requests his part of inheritance. Dad, I wish you were dead. And you know what the father does, it says? It says that he divides. It says it's wealth, but what he means is his life. The father in this story that Jesus tells is a father who releases. Now listen, the word used here for wealth, not to be fancy, but it's where we get the word biology. It's the word bios, okay? So he's talking about what he divides his life to them. To the sons. He takes what he has. He takes what he has made. He takes what he's created and he gives it. He is willing to release his stuff to them. He's willing to release, if you want to put it this way, his resources. Well, they weren't really very worthy of that, were they? It doesn't seem to matter. Because apparently the Father doesn't condition his goodness or his generosity. Listen, apparently the Father does not condition or gauge his generosity or his goodness on the worthiness of the recipient. That runs kind of against the grain of the way we're kind of conditioned to think. But that's the Father in this story. His goodness to you, to me, is not conditioned on our worthiness of it. Aren't you grateful for that? What this brings to mind is when Jesus is teaching in Matthew 5. And it was one of the most troubling things I'd always heard because, I tend to be kind of on the perfectionistic side. Anyone else do that? On the perfectionistic side? Perfectionists are people who drive themselves and everybody else crazy. Okay? But in Matthew 5, about verse 45, Jesus says you're to be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Well, great. For a perfectionist, that's a pretty tall stick, right? But here's what's going on. Jesus just said this. He said, you have to understand what the Father's like. And the Father is like this. He causes his sun to shine on who? The good and the evil. He causes the rain to fall on who? The righteous and the unrighteous. He deals with people according to how he is, not how they are. And Jesus said, be like that. Deal with the people in your life according to how you are, not conditioned on their worthiness. That's what you see here in the parable of the prodigal son. He asks, it's an awful ask. He asks for an inheritance, and the father is willing to release his stuff. Not just to him, but to the brother. He divides his life. He gives his stuff. Here's the other reason I think that we see him release his stuff, and that is because he does value his kids more than his stuff. It's in there. The father in this story is a father who releases, but not just his stuff. He releases the prodigal. Apparently, lets him free to go. I find that amazing. And when I read the story, it's like, well, why did he even allow it? And here's what came to me. You ready? I guess it depends on what your goal is. I guess it depends on what the aim is. If the aim is for the son, listen, if the aim is for the son to conform to expectations, then you glue his feet to the floor. If the aim or the goal is for the son to conform to your expectations, then you tie him to the fence post. He ain't going nowhere. But what if that isn't the aim? What if the real aim is love? How do you coerce love? You have to be willing. In the face of the pain that the request must have represented for the father, in the face of the problems that the son was just begging for himself, the father's still willing to release him. Here's a little note, by the by. Be really, really careful. If in the way you're wanting to go, you kind of have the sense where God kind of says, okay. In the end, he isn't asking. In the end, his end game isn't for you to conform to expectations. His goal, his aim, is that you'd love him and that you'd have a real relationship. That's the father in the story here. Fascinating to me. I'm going to move on. Second part, you're going to want to check around verse 20 for this one. Because the father in this story isn't just one who's willing to release. According to Jesus, the father in this story runs. Check me out. Tell me whoever's got that. Verse 20. Isn't that about where the prodigal, it says that he comes to himself while he's still far away. And so he decides, he rehearses his deal. He's going to come home to the Father. And then what does it say? It says, while he was still a far piece away. 5 things then. The Father sees him. Real quick. Don't count yourself as ever so far away from God that He can't see you. That's not the story here. Luke, the way he writes it, says that the son that went to the far away, the fur piece away country, uses the same word when it says when the Father saw him a fur piece away. He saw him, then it said he had compassion. He felt something. And compassion, that means this. That means that deep feeling toward someone, not against someone. You take compassion, you pull it wrong side out, then you've got bitterness and resentment. Don't go there. But what the Father sees when He looks and sees the Son who's still far away, it says that He has compassion. That is, He has a pull deep inside toward him. And then it says, He saw him, felt compassion, and He ran. It takes your breath away, and here's why. In Jesus' day, in that time, fathers don't run. For a long time, my motto in life was Calvin Coolidge's presidential response. Remember when they asked him if he was going to consider re-election, and remember what he said? Anybody? History? What did Calvin Coolidge say when they asked him if he would seek re-election? He said, I do not choose to run. That's been my exercise motto for a long time. I do not choose to run. In Jesus' day, fathers don't run. And the reason fathers don't run is about 2 or 3 reasons. Number one, here's one. Because to run means that you weren't organized with your time. So if something's going wrong, you send a servant to run, you don't run. Here's the second reason. Because it looks like you're desperate. You don't want to look like you're desperate. And when everything else gets put together, here's the point. Fathers don't run because it doesn't look dignified. But when this father sees his son, who's starting to try to make his way home, dignity goes out the door. That's his heart. He runs. He runs. And when I tried to make my turn and return to God, He ran for me. And when you did, He ran for you. He doesn't care about appearing dignified. You matter more than that. And He doesn't just run up and shake His hand. He doesn't run up and do the 3-clap hug. There's code for that, you know. So. We're not weird. Okay. He sees him. He feels compassion. He runs, and then it says he hugs him. He puts his arms around him and says he kisses him. Here's what it means. Here's the image. It's a dead run. And he goes running to the son, puts his arms around him, pulls his head down, and begins to kiss on his head. He is just pouring out whatever affection he had. That's the Father in this story. The one that was willing to release the Son when the Son was wanting to go away and sever all ties. When the Son turns and tries to make his way back, the Father is on a dead run with compassion leaning toward him to put his arms around him and pour out affection. Great story, isn't it? That should set the ears to buzzing in Jesus' crowd, because fathers don't do that. Here's the other thing that they don't do, and that certainly wouldn't be done. And if this was setting things buzzing, it was going to kick the hornet's nest, the next thing Jesus says. Because then he has the Father say, what? Bring out the ring, bring out the robe, bring out the sandals, kill the fatted calf, biggest feast you've ever seen here and now. Here's why that would set things buzzing. That was a honor and shame culture. You know what an honor and shame culture is? Essentially, if you do something that dishonors the family, you can pretty much consider yourself to be dishonored and dismissed from the family. Or if you do come back or are somehow accepted back, you are very low on the totem pole. And in the scriptural times, do you understand that the prodigal son did everything that would qualify him to get stoned? Deuteronomy 21, if anyone has a son who is stubborn and rebellious, count me in. I got that times 3. I'm joking. Who shows himself a glutton and a drunkard and you can't do anything with him, then you take them out with the leaders and you stone them to death and you leave them there. Talk about tough love. It's just tough. I don't think it's love. But when the father in this story says you bring the ring and you bring the robe and you bring the sandals, that isn't shaming him. That's not low man on the totem pole. You know what it is? The new ring, the new robe, the sandals, it says you are welcome back into this family. Not only you welcome back into the family, the relationship is stored. Is restored. We've got the ring on your finger. You have all the rights, all the privileges, all the authority, all the honor due you as part of this family. People had to be sucking air to hear this stuff. And what's more, you don't have to worry about getting killed. What's going to get killed today is the fattened calf. The fattened calf. The feast is on for you because you came home. Everything about this story offends the sensibilities. And the last thing we see, check it out, verse 28, and then again probably in verse 31. The last scene we see is with the father. Not with the prodigal son this time. Now it's with the older brother. The older brother stubbed up, wouldn't go into the feast. That is a serious dishonor to the family. So he was so upset with the younger brother who had dishonored the family that he now dishonors the family. And what do we see? Just like with the prodigal, where the father went out to the prodigal, we see now the father leave the feast and come out to the older brother and appeal to him. Come into the feast. Come into the feast. Come be a full part of the family. And that's the rest of the story of the prodigal son. How'd you like it? All right. But somewhere, probably, when I finished it, I thought, well, gee, Barn, that's all good, but it's not very Easter-y. And you're right. So I'm going to ask if you would indulge me for just a moment, because I'd like to take the story of the prodigal son, and I'd like to turn it on its ear. And I'd like to highlight something about Easter. Here we go. Context is different. Sometimes they just have to have some attention. And so do the little ones. No, I'm kidding. Listen to me now. Focus. I've got 3 minutes. With all respect to context and all respect to different conditions, I do want to offer you something. Do you realize that the two declarations of the Father in this story are the message of Easter? Did you put that together? You know what the two declarations of the Father are in this story? Here's one. My son, who was dead, is now alive. Tell one, tell all, come one, come all, to the feast. To the feast. What's the feast? Here's the feast, my friends. Forgiveness. You can be forgiven. Here's the feast. Freedom. Freedom from sin telling you what to do. Freedom from your past. Freedom from your failures. It's the feast. Here's the feast. How about this? It's the feast of deep joy where the Father puts his arms around you and he kisses you and he pours his affection on you because you were part of the family. Fully restored and received. That's the feast. Here's the feast. Hope. The life we are offered is better, lasts longer, and we get to enjoy it together. That's the feast. I got a little, what are they called? Messenger things or whatever they are, a little text message from a friend this morning. That's what it is. I'm not real techie. Here's the message I got from my friend. Happiest of days. Rejoice and be glad. And I looked at that and I thought, absolutely. And then I realized something. Paul said that there will be the time that comes that we will ever be with the Lord. And that came to mind for two reasons. Number one, Easter is that promise we'll ever be with the Lord. But did you notice how he said it? Plural. We. We will ever be with the Lord. Who? You and me and us and him. We'll ever be there. Welcome to the feast. That's the first declaration the Father makes. Here's the second one. You ready? The one who was dead and is now alive is your brother. Your true brother. The one who was dead and is now alive, Jesus Christ, is your brother. He loves you. He prays for you. He encourages you. He comes alongside you. He stands with you. He guides you. He teaches you. He lays it all down for you. The one who is dead and is alive is your brother. Happy Easter. He is risen. He is risen indeed.